Well, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we are at chapter 33. We're talking about Mozart and chamber music. Chamber music, remember, is music that's intended for a smaller space, from say 2 to 10 players. And then larger forms like symphonies, operas, things that require more performers and a larger place to perform them in. The first movement of the classical multi-movement cycle is usually a fast tempo. And in this case, we're talking about things like symphonies. They are in a fast tempo and they use the sonata allegro form. And they have 3 main sections. Exposition is where they give you the main theme. Here's what we're going to be expanding on later. Then they develop that theme by changing the tonality, going from major to minor, adding more notes, putting it in a higher or a lower key center. And then the recapitulation, which comes back to the original exposition, and sometimes verbatim and sometimes with a little bit of variation, but you can tell that they've come back home to where they started. So it's basically an A, B, A formula. The third movement is a triple meter pair of dances, usually a minuet and trio. Minuet being the dance itself. Minuet, a triple meter, meaning that there are 3 beats in a measure. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart contributed to nearly all musical genres of the classical era, including the symphony, sonata, concerto, chamber music, sacred music, and opera. Remember, if Mozart had lived longer, he would have probably been a successful financially opera composer, but he died too soon to see that sort of come to fruition. One of Mozart's best-known chamber works is Eine kleine Nachtmusik, which translates to a little night music, and it is a serenade for strings. That's what we're going to be hearing here in just a few minutes. Two popular expanded chamber genres in Mozart's day were the divertimento. Let me see if I can. No, I can't. The divertimento is a classical instrument genre for chamber, ensemble, or soloist, often performed as light entertainment. So it diverts your attention, divertimento, and the serenade, which is usually a slower tempo. It combines elements of chamber music and symphony. It's related to the divertimento. Divertimentos are usually lighter in character, usually a little faster in tempo than the serenade. But both of these are designed to be more chamber-like in character. The Eine kleine Nachtmusik is a serenade. It was likely written for string quartet, supported by double bass. Now remember, double bass is usually not part of a string quartet. Usually it's 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. But in this case, Mozart adds double bass, and it's meant for public entertainment, probably for outdoor performance. It has 4 movements, originally 5, but it's kind of solidified itself down to 4. And they are quick, intimate, and very well proportioned. The first movement is in that sonata allegro form, where we have the exposition of the theme, and then we develop that theme, and then we have the recapitulation where we come back to the original material. It's also known, its short name is sonata form. Same thing. The first movement of Eine kleine Nachtmusik establishes its home tonic key, and then it moves or modulates. Remember, modulation is where you change the key temporarily and then you go back to the original key. It modulates to another key and then eventually returns to its home key. So right there, here's your A section, here's your B section where you modulate, and then here's your recapitulation when you come back to the home key again. We can therefore regard sonata allegro form as a drama between 2 contrasting key areas. The A section being the first key area and the B section being the other key area, and they kind of play off of each other. The themes are exposed in the first section, developed in the second, and then restated or recapitulated in the third. Often there's bridge material that kind of takes you from one section to another. It's transitional. And especially if you're going to modulate, bridge sections are important, because if you just all of a sudden change keys, that can be really jarring. And remember, we're not into that in the classical period. Now, in the later Romantic period in the 20th century, oh yeah, change keys immediately, no warning, drop people right off the ledge. But not in the classical period. You have to prepare that modulation so that it's not jarring for your audience. Remember, everything was balanced and proportioned in the classical period. Conflict and action, which is the essence of drama, are found in the development section, where we change things up, we modulate, we add, we'll take it up to a higher key or a lower key. Often we'll go from major to minor tonality. They stretch the theme, but they don't break it. And they will take the theme and break it into its little pieces, its motives, its little musical ideas, and expand on those musical ideas. Then we come back to the recapitulation, which is the A section again. There will likely be bridge material between the development and the recapitulation. The movement often ends with a coda. Remember, coda is Italian for tail. When I give my dog Edgar a treat, he wags his little crooked coda. And a coda is an extension of closing idea. It's like the symphony goes out the door and then it comes back and says, oh, and another thing, I forgot to tell you. And that's the coda. That's the symphony telling you the things it forgot to tell you earlier and summing things up. So it also talks about the third movement. I'm going to come back to that. Let's hear the first movement first, and then we'll come back, because I think that will make more sense than trying to tell you everything and then listen. So let's hear some Eine kleine Nacht music. This is the first movement, which is the Sonata Allegro movement. So here we're going to have the exposition and a little transition section to the second theme. And then we kind of repeat that. And then we get to the development section. So this is where the B section actually takes place. And then we read, it's sort of a short development. Then we come back to the recapitulation and a coda. Here's the motive you're going to hear. Da, 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 and then it continues. You have probably heard that at some point in your life. Especially if you watch Little Einsteins, because I know they did a show on Eine kleine Nacht music. There's a little transition. Kind of gearing up to do something. Now they're going to kind of come back to that first exposition. We've heard this before. The transition back into the second theme again. Here's the second theme. Development. So we're going to take those earlier ideas and we're going to vary them in some way. And when the first beat comes back, it busts right in. You're building up. So you've heard this before, it's not any person. So there's the coated material. The coat is the big finish. You can hear the ta-da at the end. Ta-da. So the third movement is a minuet and trio. Remember, a minuet is a dance form. And it's set in an ABA form, with the A being the minuet, the B being the trio, and then we come back to the minuet again. This is often the third movement of a multi-movement cycle like a symphony. In this case, we're not exactly playing a symphony, but remember this was originally conceived for string quartet. Minuets are set in 3/4 time. They're a very familiar dance form to people of this era. You know, today we go to TikTok to learn all the new dances, but if you were considered a cultured person in the classical period, you understood minuet. You knew all the ways, all the steps, and how it was supposed to be done. So a minuet was a very familiar thing, and it was more courtly than something that was more akin to the people in the countryside, the peasants. This is something that would be danced in the royal court and considered proper for the royal court. The movement's name results from the custom of presenting two different dances as a group, the A-B-A form. At the end of the trio, you find the da capo, which means to go back to the beginning of the piece. That's where you get back to the A section. So you play the A section and then you see music for the B section. And then at the end, it literally says da capo, which means the top. Remember that you wear a cap on your head, the top of your body, da capo goes on your head. So you go back to the beginning and you play to the end of that first section again, and then you're done. This was often happened in arias. In the Baroque era, they're called da capo arias because you sing an A section, a B section, and you go back to the beginning and sing the A section again. Here's some information about Mozart personally. Mozart was born in Salzburg, which is a lovely town in Austria. The Sound of Music is set in Salzburg, if you've ever seen The Sound of Music. He was the son of Leopold Mozart, who was a court composer and violinist. His sister Manuel was also a very talented musician. He was a musical prodigy. That is not disputable. He started to compose before he was 5 years old. And by the time he was 13, he had written a pretty substantial body of work, including several operas. If you are more than 13 and you haven't written an opera yet, then you're behind Mozart. Believe me, all of us are. He was rebellious, though. He did not want a patron. He wanted to do his own thing, but this was not the right time. He wanted to be able to write what he wanted to write and have it appreciated for what it was, rather than having to write dance music for the Prince's party on Friday night. He didn't want to live that kind of life, but that's how you made your money as a musician during Mozart's time. He moved to Vienna, Austria, which was kind of the center of culture in his part of the world, and he struggled to become a freelance musician. He reached the peak of his career in the late 1780s. Notice he's only going to live until 1791, so we're talking about late in his life. He wrote 3 comic operas, The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutti. And these were all written on librettos by his friend Lorenzo di Ponte. These were very popular and well attended because they were presented not at the royal court, but in a public theater. They were masterpieces for the Viennese public, not necessarily for the people at court. His final opera was The Magic Flute, which was also considered a comic opera. And when his health was really failing and he was just about done, he was commissioned by someone, a mysterious person, to write a Requiem Mass. And the Requiem was unfinished when he died. And remember, a student of his came along later and finished it from the notes that he had left behind. So we do have the finished work now, but at Mozart's death, it was not done. He died just before his 36th birthday. So he was one of those live fast, die young, leave a good looking corpse kind of guy, except I don't think probably he left that great looking a corpse. He spent money as fast as he could make it. And so he was buried in a pauper's grave. We don't know exactly where he was buried because he was poor enough that he couldn't afford his own grave and his own headstone. When you're buried in a pauper's grave, they throw you in a big hole with a bunch of other bodies and they throw some lime in on top of you so you won't be too stinky, and that's your burial. Which, you know, for somebody who is still revered all over the world and whose music is still performed all over the world today, that's a really sad ending, a really tragic ending. This is one of the reasons why the Romantic composers in the next generation revered Mozart and almost worshipped him, because he wanted to break out of the patronage system and did not succeed at that. And they found that to be a beautiful and tragic story. And it is kind of tragic. I don't know how beautiful it is, but it really is kind of tragic. He wrote, his body of work for a 35-year-old is staggering. He wrote 23 string quartets. He wrote divertimentos and serenades. I'm kind of not music is one of those. He wrote 17 piano sonatas, all kinds of variations, orchestral music, including 40 symphonies, concertos, including 27 for the piano, 5 for violin. He was also a very good violinist, and others for solo wind instruments like flute and clarinet. He wrote comic operas, also called opera buffa, including Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni. He wrote some seria operas, which are serious operas. Idiomino, King of Crete. He wrote Zerman Singspiel, which is music for the people. These are the things that were presented at public opera houses rather than at the court, like the Magic Flute. He also wrote a lot of sacred choral music, including the unfinished Requiem. Okay, so let's go back for a moment to the third movement of Minuet of Nocturne music, and hear the Minuet Trio. So remember the minuet is said is in 3/4 time. So here's the theme we're going to hear. Bum 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 ba da da da. You're going to hear the minuet. The trio is different material, and then the minuet again. Remember, it's a da capo. So if you were looking at printed music right here, you'd see a repeat sign, and it would say da capo right there. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. We have a new thing here. It's still in 3/4 time. That has not changed. Okay, da capo. Perfectly proportioned, balanced. That is the essence of classicism in music. Right there. So a concerto then is for orchestra featuring a solo instrument. It has 3 movements alternating fast, slow, and fast. The first movement, which is the longest and most complex, is called first movement concerto form. That's pretty on the nose right there. Mozart's piano concerto in G major. The K is Kerschel. Kerschel was the cataloger of most of Mozart's music. He gathered it all together. So Mozart's music is assigned a K number because this was his 453rd piece of music. I think those are, they're divided by genre and by age, by when he wrote them. So I can't tell you exactly what that translates to. It's kind of like a star date in Star Trek. What does it mean? Yeah, we're not sure. Often concertos feature cadenzas at the end of a movement. A cadenza is an improvised solo passage for the person playing the solo instrument. It's a chance for them to show off. A classical concerto is an instrumental genre in several movements for solo instrument and orchestra. This sets it apart from some other things that are going to be solo instrument and piano. That's not a concerto. That's something else. Concertos are for solo instrument and orchestra. We talked about cadenzas. That's the virtuosic solo passage at the end of a movement, or an aria if we haven't been talking about opera. That's a chance for the soloist to show off. First movement, concerto form. It combines elements of the Baroque ritornello procedure. Remember where they'd have that little repeated ostinato pattern that would come back as kind of connective tissue between the musical ideas or the motives. And they use that in the classical concerto as well. Mozart played a big role in the development of the piano concerto because he was such a fine player of the piano. He liked working with other people who were just as talented as him, who he could show off to good effect. So he'd find a really great violinist. He'd find a really great clarinet player, and he would write something for them so that he could show them off. The orchestral parts in a Mozart concerto are just as good as the solo parts, which is not always the case. 5 of his most impressive concertos were written in the same year, in 1784. One of these was for a young student of his, Barbara von Pleuer, and he invited people to come to the premiere performance, saying, I'm going to send my carriage for this other composer because I really wanted to hear what I wrote, and I really wanted to hear this student of mine. You must be pretty good. Mozart's going to send his very own carriage to pick up another composer, and he's going to show you off to this person. So that's pretty impressive. The first movement, the orchestral exposition sets up the main themes, and then the soloist weaves figurations around these melodies, including a new its own exposition of kind of a new theme. And then a tutti, remember tutti means together, like tutti frutti ice cream. Then a full ensemble tutti leads to the development section. We're going to hear all that again when we hear this piece, so I'm not going to dwell on that right now. Here is Mozart's very own pianoforte, which is in the Mozart Museum. This means Mozart Museum, Mozarteum, in Salzburg. Notice how the keys are reversed in color. Keys that we're used to seeing as black keys are white keys, and keys that we're used to seeing as white keys are black keys on this. I guess that has to do with the availability of ivory and ebony, because that's what they were made out of at the time. That probably says a lot about what was available and what was not. So let's hear some piano concerto. Close this. Let's open this. Okay. So the soloist in this case is playing pianoforte. So we get the orchestral ritornello first. That's the first exposition and the first theme. And remember that ritornello can come back again and again. The solo exposition is going to be a repetition of the ritornello with some development. So remember, sometimes it goes up and down. That's why I like this, because it lights up for you. It makes it easy to follow. We're going to be in a major key. So the Mozart does the orchestra does the introduction. So this is finished material. Again, you're building up. Something's going to happen. Which brings us to the second theme. Where humans kind of imitate the melody that was played by the violins first. So here's the piano soloist. The orchestra comments in the background. A lot of supportive chords, kind of a homophonic texture. So the orchestra doesn't get in the way of the soloist. It's supporting, it's in a supportive role. Now, because this material is new, notice the orchestra has dropped away. The piano is having their own little moment there. So now we're kind of modulating, we're moving through some different keys. There's a little side melody that we had earlier. Remember, the violins played it first and then the woodwinds took it. So now we have the imitation of that. While to get to the development. It's almost a conversation between the piano and the orchestra. It's not really the orchestra playing a submissive role. It's like they're equals here. We just modulated into a minor key. We didn't see it coming. It just happened. A sneak. Well, we know is that transition. Something's gonna happen. You turn the piano here. So because the piano is on the moment, and then this people is trying to piece it to be supported. The trading that little side melody back and forth. So it's like the winding down, it makes finish things off. Oh, but game changer. He throws in a chord that's unexpected. And here's the cadenza. Notice the tempo is not as strict in the cadenza because it's all about the solos. So it's not as strict, it's a little more give and take. It joins in with a very big pitch. It's lovely. I can listen to Mozart for days because he's just so graceful. To have had the messy personal life that he had, his music is grace personified. It's just beautiful. By the way, those of you watching the Zoom recording, our code word this week is concerto. Remember, we just heard the piano concerto of Mozart. So concerto is our code word this week. Be sure to email me by Monday at noon with that code word. Please put the date of today's class in the subject line so I don't miss your email. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about Beethoven and the classical sonata. A sonata is written for a solo instrument or for duos, like piano and violin. So it's the counterpart to the concerto. But remember, concertos use an orchestra, whereas sonata is a duet between violin and piano, or clarinet and piano, or a solo instrument and piano. In the concerto we just heard, the piano was the solo instrument, but it was set against the orchestra. So that's the difference between the two. Sonatas were sometimes designed for amateur performance, but they were also used as showpieces for really talented composers or performers. The solo sonatas of Mozart and Beethoven are some of the most significant keyboard literature ever created. The Moonlight Sonata, which is a Beethoven piece that we're going to hear, is probably Beethoven's best known piano work. And it gives us a taste of what's coming in the Romantic period because of its expressive qualities. Beethoven is what we call a bridge composer. He bridges the gap between the classical period and the Romantic period because of the rules that he's going to stretch and break and change in his compositional style. Haydn, Mozart, and everybody else understood sonata as instrumental genre in several movements for soloist or small ensemble. It was for one or two instruments. One of those was often, if there's going to be a duet, often the second instrument is piano. And it has 3 or 4 contrasting movements. The sonata for piano alone or for 2 instruments, often violin or cello and piano, became important genre for amateurs in the home, but also for composers to show off their own music at concerts. Beethoven was a fine piano player too, so it makes sense that he would write sonatas to show off his own ability to play well. The Moonlight Sonata, which is a catalog of 24, dates from his formative years. So he's kind of in the middle of his compositional evolution, so to speak. It's more expressive than his earlier works, but it's not as expressive as he's going to get as we get closer to the Romantic period. I've never read this before. The Moonlight Sonata was given its title by the German poet Ludwig Rellstab, who likened the work to the moonlit scenery along Lake Lucerne in Switzerland. Lake Lucerne is beautiful. It's set around the town Lucerne, Switzerland is set around the lake, and it is very clear. It's clear like glass. It's just remarkable how beautiful that lake is. And there are mountains that kind of reflect in the lake. It's really great. If you get a chance to go there. And buy chocolate, because they also make fantastic chocolate there. Beethoven is said to have written this sonata for a young pupil of his. It's dedicated to her, but it seems to have been a last-minute decision. So it was probably not an overwrought statement of unrequited love. It was probably just, I think I'll dedicate this to her. Beethoven did that sort of thing. He could be pretty impulsive. Let's talk about Beethoven for a moment. Beethoven was born in Bonn, Germany. And from the age of 11, he was supporting his family as an organist and a harpsichordist because his father was an alcoholic and basically drank himself to death. At 22, he moved to Vienna. Again, Vienna, the cultural center of musical life in that part of the world. And he was not attached to the court of a prince. There were many musical-loving aristocrats who helped him in various ways. They paid him to give lessons or presented him with gifts. He never had what we think of as a traditional patron. Beethoven succeeded where Mozart wanted to succeed but did not. Beethoven was able to break out of the patronage system and write on his own terms, which is surprising because he was not an easy person to get along with. He was not always a pleasant fellow. And as he began to lose his hearing, later in his life, he became, as you can imagine, he became harder to deal with because he was cranky. Beethoven was cranky. When he started losing his hearing when he was in his 20s, and at this time there just wasn't a whole lot they could do about that. You know, if you were going deaf, you were going to go deaf, and so he was faced with an insurmountable choice. How do you continue to be a musician and a composer when you cannot hear what's going on? He wrote, "How could I possibly admit an infirmity in one sense that should have been more perfect in me than in others," meaning his hearing, because he was a proud man, and he knew he was a fantastic musician and a fantastic composer. Therefore, how could he possibly admit that he was going deaf when so much of his profession depended on being able to hear, and he felt that his hearing should be superior to everyone else's because of his talent. He considered suicide for a time, but he retired to the woods, to Heiligenstadt, and sort of walked in the woods and thought about about his life choices, and decided that he was going to rally, and he was going to be the stubborn human that he was, and he was going to continue to create and to compose and to perform as long as he possibly could in the face of this deafness that was creeping up on him. His compositional activity falls basically into 3 periods. The first period of his life is very much Haydn and Mozart-like, especially Haydn. Remember, Haydn was a tutor of Beethoven's. Beethoven did meet Mozart when Beethoven was quite young and played for him, but it was just a very brief meeting. They didn't know each other well, but he did know Haydn well. So his early compositions are much more in the same vein as Haydn and Mozart. Then later on in the middle, we began to see the beginnings of what is going to turn into 19th century music. Strong dynamic contrasts, explosive elements, and longer movements, especially in his symphonies. And then in his third period, his late period, when he is able to hear less, he actually uses more chromatic harmony and in his writing, and his symphonies become longer and more experimental. Beethoven only wrote 9 symphonies. Remember, Mozart wrote 40, but Haydn wrote over 100. So symphonies are becoming longer in time span. They're becoming more complicated. So you don't write as many of them because it takes longer to produce them. He wrote 5 piano concertos and a violin concerto, 32 piano sonatas, 17 string quartets, 1 opera, only 1, Fidelio, and the Missa Solemnis, which is a mass, a solemn mass. So let's talk about the Moonlight Sonata. Let's see, do I really need to tell you a lot about that? It's probably going to, yeah. It sort of looks ahead to things that the Romantic composers are going to love. Basically songs without words, which are kind of tone poems. They're meant to, it's an instrumental work that's meant to evoke a certain mood or a certain picture in your mind. Not truly programmatic music because it doesn't have a specific agenda. It's not telling you a specific story, but it gives you the idea of this is what a babbling brook sounds like. This is what moonlight on the water would sound like if it had sound. That's very much a romantic ideal. Romantic with a capital R, not romantic as in here are some flowers and some candy, but romantic as in the spirit of romanticism being very dramatic, being very attuned to emotional, even macabre ideas and stories and ideals. We'll hear all that when we hear it, so I'm not going to tell you about that. We'll just go to it. Okay. This piano sonata is in a minor key, which is not always the norm. Often they are written in major keys. This is written in a minor key, which is a very Beethoven thing to do. This is one of the most famous pieces of music ever created by human beings. I am very confident that you have heard this before. A strophe is like a musical idea. It's like a motive or a theme. So here they're showing you what the music actually looks like. You can hear these long notes. All this has been the introduction of the A section. We're going to move into the B section, which is still uses that 3-note idea we were just looking at. So this is bringing us back to basically the A section. And then we have a little coda at the end. So that's not Haydn. that doesn't sound like Haydn. This is something new. This is a stretching and a change of the rules. He's not technically breaking any rules. He's still following the ABA form, but he's doing something really different and something new with it. Something that Haydn would not have probably thought to have done. It sounds a lot different than the Mozart that we've heard. It's set in number one, it's set in that minor key, and that makes a big difference in the mood of the piece. And it doesn't have the lilt or the lift of a Mozart piece, a Mozart piano sonata. It sounds darker, I guess, is a way to put it. It's dark without being scary, for lack of a better word. It's new. It's something different. You can really hear the difference in that. So speaking of Beethoven and breaking rules, Beethoven's symphonies are where we're really going to bridge the gap between the classical period and the coming romantic period and the 19th century. Beethoven's music is grounded in the classical tradition, but it pushes the limits in a way that help define the emerging romantic sensibility. He's going to help us bridge that gap. Beethoven only wrote 9 symphonies, and they show his experimentation with classical ideals and conventions. He knows those rules. He studied those rules. Now he's going to find ways to bend them, stretch them, maybe even break them a little. It says his best known symphony is his 5th, which I agree, that's very well known. I also think his 9th is very, very well known. And it's built on a famous 4-note motive that permeates all 4 movements. He takes this 4-note idea and he uses it in all 4 movements of the symphony, which helps to unify the entire piece. That was not necessarily done before Beethoven. Remember, there were rules about how you wrote symphonies, what kind of movement came. You went fast, slow, fast, and you didn't necessarily use material from the first movement in the 2nd or the 3rd or the 4th movement. Those could be new material, completely different. Beethoven's going to take this 4-note idea and he's going to use it in all 4 movements to tie everything together, which is kind of a new concept. Symphonies were kind of that was Beethoven's jam. I mean, he was good at writing a lot at everything, but symphonies were where he could really kind of cut loose and explore, because he had the color palette of the orchestra. And he had more, if you only have red and green on your color palette, you're going to only paint red and green. But if you have a lot of other colors available to you, probably the art you're going to produce is going to be much more colorful and, frankly, probably more interesting. And so when you have the color palette of the orchestra and all these different musical sounds available to you, you can create things that are perhaps more expanded and even perhaps more interesting because you have all that availability. His 3rd symphony, the Eroica, was originally dedicated to Napoleon, who Mozart believed was a liberator who was coming in to be a hero to the French people, a leader of the common people. But then Napoleon decided he was going to be emperor, and he declared himself emperor, which really ticked Beethoven off. So he tore up the dedication page of the Eroica, and it was no longer dedicated to Napoleon. Instead, he dedicated it to the idea of heroism of unknown heroes. And so he removed that dedication because Napoleon made him mad. The Fifth Symphony, which we're going to talk about here, is a model of the genre of symphony. It's kind of the quintessential classical moving toward romantic symphony. The Ninth Symphony is also called the choral symphony because for the first time, a set of vocal soloists, a soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, and a chorus join the orchestra to sing the Ode to Joy, which is a setting of a poem by Friedrich von Schiller that talks about the universality of people all being in one big brotherhood of man all across the globe. This was the first time that vocal soloist and chorus had been incorporated into a symphony, not a concerto, not a cantata, not an oratorio, but a symphony. And they only appear in that last movement. Most of us know the tune for Ode to Joy, even if we don't know the symphonic poem or we've never heard it in its original German. Many churches use the Ode to Joy melody with different words as a hymn, and it's in most hymnals, in most Christian churches, Catholic and Protestant. The Fifth Symphony is arguably Beethoven's best known because of that opening movement. It's ba 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 bum, ba 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 bum. We hear that and you instantly recognize that, even if you didn't know where it came from before. You've heard that. Remember that little idea, just those 4 notes, is going to permeate the entire symphony. This unification makes the symphony an early example of cyclical form, or a cycle. Cyclical form is a structure where musical material such as a theme or a musical motive, it comes in later movements. It's presented in the first, but then it returns in other movements. And that's something that's going to happen a lot in the 19th century, but it's a new idea here in the 18th century. So let's hear some Fifth Symphony. Okay, we're going to hear several movements. This is the first. Here is that 4-note motive. Ba 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 bum, ba 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 bum. You will instantly recognize that. I forgot to mention allegro con brio. Con brio means with life. So fast and lively. You might get 4 notes, not the same notes. And underneath, you can hear that bum, 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 underneath in the bass line. He wants to be sure you got it in your ear. So he repeats the entire thing. So the graphic there is showing you all those little four-note motives that are scattered throughout this development section. Yeah, the full the bracketing. Recapitulation. So we come back to the first theme. In the first theme. So let's hang on. Let's go back to that for just a moment. So technically, no rules were broken here, right? We've got the first theme, second theme, the development section. We have a recapitulation. We come back. Got a codon in the end. No rules were broken here. But this does not sound like Haydn. This is not Haydn. This is not even Mozart. This is something, again, something new. This is something different. This is a stretching of the rules. It's not light after dinner entertainment. This requires more thought. It requires more participation of the listener. So again, we're going to look for those 4-note ideas here in the second movement. Andante con moto, a walking pace with motion. So walking with purpose. Remember, the second movement of a symphony is slower. We have the allegro movement. So this is Andante. He's not breaking any rules. So this movement is basically a theme and variations, because we see the variations are coming. So we're going to vary the first theme now. Has that kind of galloping dotted rhythm. With clarinet kind of floating above that string pattern. So the wigglings kind of float on top of what the strings are doing. You hear that cello pulse underneath. Sounds kind of ominous, like something's about to happen. And again, we get the woodwind floating on top of what the strings are doing. with long sustained tones. It almost sounds like something's creeping up on you right here. You can see why these confident be hard to. You can almost picture it in your mind. Also notice the variation in dynamics. The orchestra goes from very powerful and loud to really soft and delicate within this movement. We've heard both extremes. Here you hear them crescendoing, getting louder as they go, but then they back off. That's a little bit Haydn-like. You think it's gonna get really loud, then he pulls the rug out from under you. Remember, a rocket theme is where it builds excitement, often rising in pitch. So here's our rocket theme that we're gonna hear in the third and fourth movement. It's gonna start down here low and work its way up very quickly to almost a 2-octave leap in range. That's a big change. Scherzo is the dance movement, scherzo and trio. For that. It sounds very similar to the opening noted of the first movement. It's not verbatim, but it sure does sound pretty similar. Going up to something. It mentions that it begins in a fugue style, like a fugue. When we talk about Bach, when the different voices enter. It does not complete the fugue. Again, it sort of gives you that idea and pulls the rug out from under you. It's almost like he's throwing things at the wall and see what sticks. So we're winding down the trio for recapitulation of the scherzo. Except it's not the same. Again, he's taking that rule and he's bending it. Now, another rule that Beethoven's going to bend and break right here is instead of having a separated third and fourth movement, he's going to feed from the third movement, the scherzo, right into the beginning of the fourth movement by exposing a new theme. What they're showing you there is the timpani part. It's kind of like that. It's going to be reaching here. Transition, going to the second thing. It still has those three initial notes, but they're built up through these triads and triplets. It goes in another theme there in the closing theme. Why not? Here's another idea. You listen for that rocket theme that Dave was doing, to come back to ventilation. He's building implication, no coming, because that's good. Here, something's going to happen. Just tell. But instead of giving us that ta-da, yay, we win, he goes back to the ideas from the scherzo, from movement 3. There's our recapitulation. He made its way to This is the second theme. It has its triple image. Closing theme, but it's not really the component has to be in its final say. Beethoven is fond of these cadences that have those big block chords. You hear those in a lot of his pieces. Instead of winding down and slowing down, he actually speeds up here. All right, so for next week, please complete on Inquisitive chapters 33, 34, 35, and 36, which is what we heard tonight. And we will pick it up with Mozart and the Marriage of Figaro next week. Okay, as always, if you have questions, please email me. If you're watching the Zoom recording, be sure you send me the code word by Monday. And please complete your inquisitives. If you are catching up on inquisitives, please let me know when you've done them so that I will know to go back and get your grade, because I don't always go back and revisit old material unless I know I need to. Okay, if there are no questions, I will see you next week.